Here we are in the center of Paris, in front of Notre Dame Cathedral, a truly remarkable monument to the power and glory of the medieval church. Look how it's designed. Its tall, vertical decorations draw the eye upward towards heaven. Indeed, the medieval church was the most powerful institution in Europe at the time, and these constructions helped create medieval cities. Imagine what it would have been like coming from the feudal countryside to an urban center like Paris and finding a construction like this. It's built entirely in stone, and its technology had to be worked out generation by generation.
And the church's dominance of society also expressed itself in the world of art.
In the early medieval world, most of the art that was produced in monasteries on illuminated manuscripts. And most of the artists, in fact, were manuscript illustrators.
Well, that period which we understand as the late medieval and early Renaissance period is that time when artists began to rely more and more on motifs from the ancient classical world. Specifically, they were concerned with how objects were distributed in space and moved through space. So essentially what one is seeing is a move from a God's eye view of the world to a man's view of the world.
The anonymous painters and sculptors of those days were concerned almost exclusively with religious themes. Their aim was simply to use time-honored techniques to produce images that would communicate a spiritual message. The representation of reality in the ordinary, temporal world was not their intention. But art and artists were about to change forever, and the late medieval world would see the development of new ideas and techniques that would lead on to the glory of the 16th century High Renaissance and art as we know it today.
This is the medieval city of Florence, in the center of the Italian peninsula, with Rome to the south and Milan to the north. Now, Italy in the 1300s was a collection of individual city-states, and there were two types of them. One type, the Ghibelline, such as Milan and Siena, took their charter from the Holy Roman Emperor, and in essence, they were a feudal society where power was vested in the king. The other type of city, such as Florence, took its charter directly from the Pope, and in this sense, the Pope was happy to collect his money for the charter and leave the people to rule themselves as they saw fit.
Gradually, secular thinking, emphasizing the importance of trade, commerce, and an economy based on money, began to be established. In England and Northwest Europe, wool and textiles were a substantial source of new wealth. While in Italy, with its historic trade links to the East, merchants, tradesmen, and bankers began to ply increasingly profitable trade in urban centers such as Padua, Siena, and Florence. It was against this new, secular background that the great artists of the late medieval world would achieve their greatest results.
Another tradition, however, was about to be started here in Florence by their master, Giotto. And the way he was to conceive of painting was to change the history of painting for the next 500 years.
Born near Florence around 1267, little is known of Giotto's early life, like so many artists of his time. But between 1302 and 1305, we know he was working in the northern Italian town of Padua, painting the walls of the Cappella d'Arena, using a technique virtually unknown since ancient times.
In effect, he put away line as a way of making painting and started to use patches of tone. This way of working had hardly been exploited since Roman times. In effect, you could make an image with rough areas, rough patches of tones, and by varying them, create much deeper illusions of space.
Giotto rediscovered the fresco, the method of painting with watercolors on plaster while the plaster is still wet.
Fresco is an extremely durable form of painting, but it is very laborious. You start with a ground of rough mortar known as arricciato, and when that is dry, you lay on that a much more smooth and expensive plaster layer called the intonaco, which is made of ordinary gypsum and also ground marble. The key thing is that whilst this intonaco is wet, the design is painted on. The thing to remember with fresco is that because you have to paint on a wet plaster surface on the intonaco, it has to be done quickly. Therefore, as a master, Giotto would have to have been extremely decisive and deft in the way he wielded the brush.
More remarkable than Giotto's rediscovery of the fresco technique, however, were the images he created using it. But it wasn't the subject matter that made works such as The Mourning of Christ revolutionary. Visual depictions of events surrounding the life of Christ were commonplace. But the illustrations of biblical events that were created, mainly for manuscripts, were simply a means of communicating sacred themes to a mainly illiterate world. This 12th century German manuscript illustration of the Annunciation, for example, makes no attempt to represent the Virgin or the angel as physically real figures existing in real space. The artist would simply not have been concerned with this. What was remarkable about Giotto's equally religious work was that it had spatial depth.
The Lamentation of Christ, perhaps one of the best known of Giotto's fresco scenes, is one of 57 that was painted to the order of Enrico Scrovegni, a wealthy merchant of Padua. He guides us to the principal subject of the scene, namely the dead Christ, by the gazes and the gestures of the figures. The sky is treated in the typically Giottesque way, no clouds, and perhaps that lends emphasis to the scene below. That means that our gaze is almost inevitably directed to the principal subject. By the arrangement of the figures and their gestures, the eye takes in the subject all at once and focuses straight away on the principal subject, which is, in this case, the dead Christ.
While there are many aspects of Giotto's painting which remain medieval, for example in the landscape of this painting, the Lamentation, notice how the figures are fully in the round, how daring it is, as it were, to allow the ladies in the lower left to turn their backs to the surface of the painting.
Giotto's frescoes in Padua, and later works such as his fresco series for the Church of Santa Croce in Florence, are now considered to form the starting point of modern Western art. Giotto's work also made him famous. The great writer Dante described him as the greatest artist of his day.
The importance of an artist such as Giotto could be very useful to the patron because the artist was able to bring prestige to the patron, and this can be seen in Giotto's work for the Arena Chapel in Padua.
Giotto's fame spread throughout Italy, and so did his new discoveries. In the Tuscan hilltop town of Siena, a near neighbor but great rival of Florence, the influence of Giotto made itself felt.
These two cities also competed in another art form, that of painting. Now, painting did not really come from Northern Europe. It was essentially an art form that came from the Byzantine tradition of Greece. Here, there was a long tradition of icon painting, in which beautiful linear figures were drawn against a reflective gold background that sparkled in the light. These icon paintings, which were usually done on panels of wood with egg tempera painted over them, were jewel-like masterpieces that formed the center of the interior of the Italian church.
This can be seen in the Annunciation, now on display in the Uffizi Gallery, Florence. We are once again presented with the biblical story of the visitation by the Archangel Gabriel to the Virgin Mary.
The Annunciation, which was by far his most famous painting, takes ideas which in some sense appear rather archaic, but when one looks at it as opposed to the earlier work, can show how he's injected quite a sense of naturalism into some of the images. Within Martini's work, we can see that he uses an extremely elegant, sinuous line in his painting, and that's expressed very sophisticatedly within the two figures. The way he treats the line when he paints the figure of Gabriel is very much more flowing, very much more sensuous than the way he treats the line when he paints the Virgin, because he wants to create this atmosphere that she's in some way rather frightened about this sudden apparition. And so he makes the figure of the angel very much more relaxed and calm.
Due to the elaborate frame, however, we must look through a series of wooden columns that stand forward of the painting, and this creates a very interesting and dynamic space. The Immaculate Conception was, as it were, a shift between heavenly space and earthly space, and in this painting, the frame has a spatial role that reiterates and repeats this shift of heavenly and earthly spaces. We move, as it were, into an intermediate space where heaven and earth touch for that miraculous moment.
Although paintings such as the Annunciation, together with Giotto's earlier work, represented a genuine step forward in the artistic representation of depth and space, such 14th century images still strike us as unsophisticated in comparison to the great masterpieces of later times. The problem was that the ability to authentically reproduce three-dimensional scenes on a two-dimensional surface had not yet been discovered. It would be the 15th century before it was. In the mid-1300s, however, the Italian artists could be excused for not concerning themselves with this art technique.
The first half of the 1300s was a period in which Florence and Siena, Martini and Giotto competed with each other. This period, however, was brought to a catastrophic end. First, there was a famine, then there was a flood, and worst of all, the plague came in two different forms. Indeed, in some of the small towns around Florence here, up to 80% of the population died. It marked a drastic period of change in Italian city-states. In effect, there was a return to a more conservative Gothic style in painting. And the Renaissance properly, the early Renaissance, didn't get going until 1400.
The beginning of the 15th century saw Florence preeminent amongst the northern Italian city-states. In economic terms, the city flourished. Its economic success was symbolized by the golden florin, the most highly regarded currency in Europe. It was truly a golden age, and within this environment of prosperity, men began to think back to a previous golden age, the glorious days of ancient Rome and Greece, much of whose knowledge had been maintained by the Arabs as Europe languished in the Dark Ages.
Florence was a hotbed of activity in the 15th century. It so happened that the Medici family, who were merchants and bankers, as well as bringing a huge amount of wealth to Florence through their fiscal activities, were also very interested in learning. They were interested in what was called humanism, and part of humanism was to develop an interest in the work of antiquity, particularly a new discovery of Latin texts by writers such as Cicero and Plato.
The 14th century in Florence saw the gradual emergence of a new building in the heart of the city, the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore.
Now, by the beginning of the 1400s, the builders of the Cathedral of Florence were in a bit of a difficult spot. They'd finished the bulk of the cathedral and left an opening at the crossing of the church that was so large no technology was available to build a dome to fill such a large space.
They were keen for the cathedral to be topped with a great dome. But no architect of the age possessed the technical skills to carry out this task. until Filippo Brunelleschi. Trained as a goldsmith, he became a master architect. In addition to mastering Gothic architectural techniques, he also studied passionately the structures and techniques of the ancient Romans.
He was a close friend of Donatello, and they went on a very important trip to Rome at this time. He noticed some of the Roman buildings that had fallen down, and they had domes of a sort. But he noticed that unlike the Gothic arch, there was no keystone at the top of a Roman dome. He began to look more closely, and he discovered that instead of building tall vertical ribs that locked at the top, that the buildings built by the Romans were in effect built as a series of smaller and smaller donuts. Of course, the Romans had a substance called concrete. The formula at this time had been lost. But Brunelleschi figured out a way of laying bricks in a herringbone pattern that interlocked so that the dome could be built in a series of self-supporting rings. No wooden frame was necessary. In effect, Brunelleschi mixed the Gothic system of ribs, which you can still see in the dome, and the circular system of building that he got from the Romans. Together, he was able to make a twin-walled system that allowed him to build what still remains today the second largest masonry dome in the world.
Brunelleschi's achievement in creating the cathedral dome remains his most enduring achievement in architecture, and one still appreciated by thousands of people who visit Florence every year. But other buildings designed by Brunelleschi, such as the Foundling Hospital, also in Florence, display the genius of a man who, while inspired by the classical world and passionate about their techniques, sought to create a new architecture for the new age of prosperity that he lived in.
In this building, he used a rigorous system of proportions that he derived from classical architecture. The height of the columns is equal to the distance between the columns, and the same dimension is used again on the depth of the bay. This part of the bay is based upon a cube, and above this he's placed a sphere that is cut on top of it and is the same size. This system of proportions, based on 1:2, 1:5, and 2:5, is used throughout the whole building. This sense of balance and proportion was something that wasn't used in Gothic architecture. In addition, the whole city square here is unified by the same architecture. In other words, this is the first large-scale modern urban design in 1,000 years.
As we have seen, 14th century artists such as Giotto and Martini attempted to introduce depth into their paintings, a significant step towards the notion of painting as a reflection of reality, rather than the simple message of spirituality. The artists of classical times had also attempted to solve the problems of representing three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface, but with limited success. They were unable to formulate a consistent mathematical system to achieve this. But it was the genius of Brunelleschi that finally solved the problem, and in the process changed painting forever. In the years before his work on Florence Cathedral Dome, Brunelleschi discovered the laws of perspective.
Brunelleschi, as an architect, had devised what was the first abstract mathematical way of rendering spatial recession. Almost certainly what we would call the centric point system, where you set a vanishing point on a surface, draw the horizon, set out the orthogonal lines, and your design is disciplined by that.
The discovery of the laws of perspective represented a revolution in visual art. And the first artist to take advantage of the new knowledge was Masaccio. A Florentine like Brunelleschi, and likewise originally trained as a goldsmith, Masaccio created no more than a handful of works in his lifetime.
Masaccio, although he did have a short career, has a very significant impact on artists who were to work after him. In his Holy Trinity, which still remains in Santa Maria Novella in Florence, you can see how Masaccio has begun to apply the mathematical rules of perspective to create an illusion of space. And the illusion of space creates a dramatic impact and adds emphasis to the story which he's concerned with depicting.
The Masaccio Trinity, it's in Santa Maria Novella, the church in Florence. And it's in fact painted on the side wall of the nave of the church. It's a fresco. It's an image which purports to be like a small side chapel. He began to study the effects of perspective, and he began to learn perspective from his friend who was the architect Brunelleschi. And what he wanted to do when he painted the Trinity was to create this impression that one looked into a small side chapel, and there the Trinity is the event that's happening within the side chapel. And because of that, what he wanted to do was to make it as though the side chapel was a part of the building itself. So the idea of creating the perspective was to make the sense that space was continuous into the image. For this, he created a thing which was known as one-point perspective, where all of the vanishing lines converge to one vanishing point in the painting. And when we see early perspective paintings, most of them are of this type, this one-point perspective.
It's difficult to overstate the significance of Masaccio's work to the development of Western painting. Frescoes such as the Holy Trinity and the Tribute Money, with its dramatic positioning of Christ's head relative to the perspectival lines of the buildings, caused a sensation, because nothing like this had ever been seen before. Tragically, Masaccio was unable to enjoy the rewards of his artistic achievements. He died in 1428 at the age of 27. The system of perspective he used would live on, however, and would be formalized in 1436 by Leon Alberti in his book On Painting, which would become the standard textbook on perspective for generations. An architect perhaps best known for the facade of Santa Maria Novella in Florence. Alberti's abilities extended far beyond art theory and architecture. A musician, a poet, and a philosopher, well-versed in science, politics, and the knowledge of the ancients, Alberti was truly one of the leading lights in Florence of the first half of the 15th century. We might be tempted to use the phrase Renaissance man to describe a man of such learning and ability, and rightly so. The artistic and intellectual melting pot that was Florence in those decades is now considered to be the period of the early Renaissance, when artists and intellectuals consciously sought the rebirth of great artistic achievement after the long period since the decline of ancient Rome. Our notion of the Middle Ages as the period between the two great flowerings of human civilization stems from this period. It was truly a remarkable age, with groundbreaking developments in all the visual arts. In architecture and painting, as we have seen, but also in sculpture, with the work of one Donato di Niccolo di Betto Bardi, better known to history as Donatello. The third in the great Florentine triumvirate of the early Renaissance, alongside Brunelleschi and Masaccio, and widely considered to be the greatest artist of his century, Donatello was, like so many of his contemporaries, trained as a goldsmith, but quickly discovered his true artistic calling. In keeping with the prevailing artistic thinking, he was fascinated by the works of classical times. As a sculptor, this was not surprising. The works of the Roman sculptors were amongst the greatest achievements of the classical world, displaying an understanding of human anatomy that Donatello sought to regain with his own detailed studies of the human form. But like his contemporaries, Donatello was not concerned with simply copying the works of the ancients. He sought to combine the skills of the past with the humanistic spirit of his own age, and succeeded magnificently. One of Donatello's earlier works, a marble statue of St. George, which was made for the facade of Florence's Or San Michele, demonstrates his ability.
Donatello has turned his image of St. George into a symbol of the model citizen, the regular local boy who's been called upon to do great things in an unexpected situation. When you look at his face, you can see that he looks rather unsure, somewhat anxious and nervous. And yet when the opportunity arises, although he doesn't seem to be heroic, in fact he turns out to be. While completely reworking the freestanding figure, Donatello also did something else incredible. He reinvented the low-relief carving. Below the St. George, we can see a shallow panel that shows George killing the dragon. Here, he's taken up Giotto's technique of making pictures by modulating tonal areas and turned this into a way of working in low relief. In other words, he simply carves a section to create a dark patch. And in this way, by modulating the lights and the darks, he can create a deep spatial picture. No one ever, not even the Romans, learned to carve low-relief panels in this way. It gave low-relief carving a pictorial power that it had never had before.
While Florence experienced the dramatic new ideas and works of the early Renaissance, across the Alps in northwestern Europe, artists were slower to cast off the traditions of the past. The period around the turn of the 15th century was dominated by what became known as the International Gothic style, an intensely decorative style with a strong emphasis on line, as can be seen in the National Gallery's Wilton diptych, a late 14th century tempera work. Though the name of the creator is now lost, the person responsible for the production of the work is known, for he is depicted in it. It is that tragic monarch, Richard II of England, who is kneeling before Mary and Jesus. The Wilton diptych is what is known as a donor portrait. Donor portraits, in which a patron's image would be incorporated into a painting of a biblical or mythological scene, were extremely popular in late medieval times, and would continue to be commissioned across Europe well into the Renaissance.
In the latter part of the 1300s and the beginning of the 1400s, Gothic architecture and art became an international style, as we can see here in Amsterdam's New Church.
The international Gothic style of paintings, such as the Wilton diptych, was not an artistic school in the modern sense of the phrase. Rather a similarity of style that achieved popularity across Europe, especially among the artists of the Netherlands. It was artists from this part of Europe who would produce a large quantity of the important artworks produced away from Italy in the late medieval period. Although tragically, much of the art of the Low Countries would be destroyed in the religious conflicts and disputes that would later afflict the region.
The Limburg brothers, from here in Holland, became part of this international movement.
The Limburg brothers were important artists who were working within the circle of the Duke of Burgundy. The Duke of Burgundy was a religious man. Prayer was a very important part of his life, and he had what was called a Book of Hours. The Trévicher was the name of the Book of Hours, which was decorated by the Limburg brothers and provided an excellent opportunity for them to really take their work with miniature painting and illuminated manuscripts to its full potential. They were able to experiment with new pigments, new designs, which religious subject matter and the theme of prayer allowed them to do.
It is one of the finest examples of the international Gothic style, in that you have very rich colour, especially of costume, but also very interestingly there is some new realism coming in. The individual motifs of landscape, of trees, plants, animals, this sort of thing are shown as we would understand it naturalistically and realistically. There is also an attempt at spatial recession by the use of plane surfaces, a curving path or a curving river, perhaps a castle wall shown on the diagonal, and also very often, certainly in the one which depicts the month of October, where the chateau is shown in what we would call bifocal perspective, where the walls are receding away at an angle from the viewer. So in that sense, they show some of the newer art. But of course, it's not the same as that which is being practiced in Italy, or would be practiced in Italy, in the early part of the 15th century, because there is no unified perspective system. Again, the eye is still allowed to wander over the richness of the motifs and the colours, instead of being focused on one principal subject or one principal point in the composition.
And although the ideas of the Italian masters began to spread throughout Europe, the art of the Netherlands retained its own individual identity, with its greatest master undoubtedly Jan van Eyck. Like many artists of his age, little is known of the early life of Van Eyck, and even less of his brother Hubert, who is believed to have been involved with the creation of some of his early work. By 1425, however, we know that he was established in Lille as a court painter to Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, a relationship that would make Jan van Eyck a wealthy man. By 1432, he had completed what many considered to be his greatest work, an altarpiece for the Cathedral of St. Bavo in Ghent, which Hubert almost certainly helped to create. As with the earlier work of the Limbourg brothers, the new system of perspective is absent. And yet the Ghent altarpiece achieves an impression of 3 dimensions, with its immaculate detail and tonal contrasts, both in the individual figures and in the landscape, to create an effect quite unlike any contemporary work in Italy. And another innovative aspect of the Ghent altarpiece is the material which Jan van Eyck chose to execute the work. For Van Eyck was the pioneer in the use of a new kind of painting, oil painting.
Van Eyck was in fact considered to be the founder, or the person who invented the technique of oil painting, though in fact it was probably invented by a number of artists at the time. But what oil paint allows the painter to do is to produce extremely realistic, almost photographically realistic images.
He is best known for his treatment and handling of light. He achieved this by the use of several hard resin oil glazes, laid usually, though not always, on a ground colour or dead colour of tempera. It was these glazes which gave his work that intense luminosity which so characterises the Flemish school of art, and which was regarded by the Italians, when they saw some of his work, as almost a miracle.
With the new flexibility of oil paints, Van Eyck produced a body of work that would earn him fame in his own country as the king of painters. One of his best-known works is the Virgin of Chancellor Roland, part of the collection of the Louvre in Paris. The Madonna and Holy Child are seated beside a kneeling Nicholas Roland, Philip the Good's chancellor, in another fine example of a donor portrait, with the background landscape providing a marvelous illustration of the detail with which Jan van Eyck executed his masterpieces. Significantly, Van Eyck was also commissioned to produce work without any religious dimension whatsoever. He was a portraitist of the highest order, the first great master of the genre in the post-medieval era. And although much of his work has been lost, including all his commissions for Philip the Good, his 1434 portrait, which apparently depicts the marriage of a wealthy Italian merchant, Giovanni Arnolfini, to his new bride, has survived. Apparently, although some analysts believe the two figures to be Jan van Eyck himself and his wife, whoever the man and woman depicted actually were, the betrothal of the Arnolfini, now on display in London's National Gallery, triumphantly asserts Jan van Eyck's abilities.
In the case of the Arnolfini marriage, what we are witnessing is what could be described without exaggeration as a catalogue of textures, from the wood of the floorboards of the bedroom to the richness of the fabrics and the transparency of the glass and the hard adamantine sheen of the mirror. The painting is essentially an an allegory of marriage as well as a depiction of it. Almost certainly Jan van Eyck is painting what he actually witnessed. The inscription over the mirror in Latin, Johannes de Eyck fuit hic, Jan van Eyck was here, and the date 1434. And if we look in the mirror, we can just see two tiny reflected figures in it, as well as the Arnulfines, so perhaps he was one of the witnesses. It is full of symbols of the allegory of the sanctity of marriage. The fruit on the windowsill signifies the innocence of man before the fall. The single candle burning in the chandelier signifies both the all-seeing eye of Christ and also the sanctity of the marriage oath. It's not a large work. It's the sheer density of motifs which would certainly show it's a typically northern work, and of course it has all the magnificence of Van Eyck's oil painting technique with the translucent glazes, which not only give a wonderful depth of colour, but which are also extremely durable. The painting has survived to the present day with virtually no restoration work done.
Although secular themes would become increasingly important to the artists of Northern Europe, work inspired by religion continued to be widespread, as can be seen in the work of the other great figure of the 15th century Netherlands art, Roger van der Weyden, a contemporary of Van Eyck, who became the official painter to the city of Bruges in 1435. Christian themes dominated his life's work, especially images of the Virgin Mary and the crucifixion. The descent from the cross is typical and shows van der Weyden, like Van Eyck, using great detail, but arranging the figures around Christ in confined space, producing a strong spiritual impression. Though it's known that van der Weyden produced a number of secular works in his lifetime, including now-lost erotic nudes, his religious masterpieces have secured him a place in European art history. For all their genius, 15th century Netherlands artists such as Van Eyck and van der Weyden were still working within an older tradition, and one which would be continued by subsequent figures such as Hugo van der Goes and Dirk Bouts, whose altarpiece for the Church of St. Peter in Louvain actually shows the donors in contemporary dress at the Last Supper, linking the real world with the divine world. Although the new thinking in Italy was known to some Northern European artists at the time, it would be later before mathematical perspective and the other discoveries made by Brunelleschi, Masaccio, and the Florentine greats of the early 15th century would make themselves fully felt north of the Alps. Back in Italy, however, the new thinking was being applied with gusto, and the Italian art of the later 15th century was a time of almost unrivaled innovation and experiment, laying the ground for the wonders of the century to come. Unsurprisingly, artists from Florence were heavily involved with a new culture of experiment and discovery, and for the Florentine Paolo Uccello, a craftsman obsessed with geometry, the new ideas of mathematical perspective were massively significant.
In the 15th century, artists who were working north of the Alps were interested in design. They were interested in flat patterns, and they weren't interested in a realistic depiction of space, whereas artists working in Italy were beginning to be interested in a more naturalistic representation of form, of space. So they were starting to move away from a focus on aspects of decoration, aspects of design, which could detract from a more lifelike representation of nature.
Elsewhere in Italy, the ideas that influenced Uccello were manifesting themselves. From Padua came Andrea Mantegna, a true great of 15th century Italian art. In his early frescoes, his use of perspective is obvious, but it is the form of the human figures that is most striking. As solid as Donatello's sculptures, which influenced him greatly, their spatial distribution lends the whole scene an air of realism and drama. Mantegna's mastery of what might be termed an architectural approach to space can be also seen with his altarpiece, The Madonna Enthroned, where he uses the frame columns as an integral part of the spatial definition of the three panels, whose force is amplified by the artist's use of natural light to illuminate the altarpiece by means of a window specially cut in the choir wall. The importance of space and light in painting was also recognized by another Italian, Piero della Francesca, who in true Renaissance style wrote books on the geometry and perspective that interested him so much. Like Mantegna, his greatest works were frescoes, created for the church of San Francesco in Arezzo. If we take the fresco from this series that depicts the legendary dream of the Emperor Constantine, his vision of the cross which led to his conversion to Christianity, we see that not only has Piero incorporated the theories of perspective, but has dramatically made use of light to create the illusion of depth. The sense of distance between the pike-carrying soldier and the opening to the tent, bathed as it is in light, is striking, and Piero's innovations made possible the development of night scenes in painting. For all the artistic developments going on across Italy as the 15th century neared its end, Florence remained the center of artistic excellence. And it was Florence that produced the last great Italian painter of the 15th century, Sandro Botticelli.
In a way, Botticelli was like any other Renaissance man. He had to negotiate two worlds, both the Christian and the recently discovered classical world. For example, in this painting, we can see the long, linear treatment of the human form, particularly in the Virgin Mary in the center. Yet around the Virgin Mary, we see the 12 apostles receiving the Holy Spirit at the moment of Pentecost. Their faces and hands show many traces of Botticelli's knowledge of classical sculpture. Botticelli, in the end, renounced his classical tradition and burned many of these paintings. Fortunately, this is one which deals with a Christian subject that has survived this change of heart.
In many ways, the achievements of Botticelli are more subtle than other masters of the century, although in one of his earlier works, we can identify a significant technical development. The illusion of a central pyramid as the defining focus of the painting, a technique which would be widely adopted by the generations that followed him. But when we consider what is undoubtedly Botticelli's best-known work, The Birth of Venus, in the Uffizi Gallery in his home city, it almost seems as if the innovations of the century concerned with perspective, proportion, and anatomy had passed him by. But his aims, with The Birth of Venus, were more concerned with art than with science, and the enduring popularity of this work is testimony to his achievement.
Birth of Venus was painted around about 1485 by Sandro Botticelli. Botticelli, in fact, rather rejected the rather austere Renaissance ideas that artists like Masaccio wanted to develop for a rather more linear style of painting. And the painting itself depicts Venus arriving at the shore of Cyprus. When we see her, we might think that this perhaps is a bright, sunny morning. But what we actually see in the painting is that it's rather a cold, grey morning. And perhaps her birth wasn't quite the auspicious event that one would imagine it to be.
It is a rather elegant rendering of what is a rather a grim legend in classical history, where Saturn tore off the testicles of Kronos, Uranus' father, and hurled them into the sea, and the sea erupted into foam, and Venus arose from that foam, hence her Greek name of Aphrodite, which means risen from the sea, and the Latin Venus, and Greco-Latin name of Venus Anadyomene, which means risen from the sea.
Botticelli himself, as a painter, depicted these images for commission purposes. He was commissioned by a wealthy patron who was Lorenzo di Pier Francesco de' Medici, And The Birth of Venus is one of a number of paintings, such as the Primavera and Palace and the Centaur, all of which have the same sorts of imagery, where we see very elegantly drawn women, sometimes slightly scantily clad, which come as quite a new departure, and it shows how far Renaissance ideas had developed, that these kind of images could become acceptable.
It's significant that Botticelli's friend was the sculptor and painter Andrea del Verrocchio, whose magnificent statue of the Florentine general Colleoni can still be seen in Venice today.
Florentine artists at the end of the 1400s made a greater study of human anatomy, and they also became interested in trying to show animals and figures in motion. And for this reason, the Colleoni monument is a wonderful example. In fact, this is only the second bronze equestrian monument in over 1,000 years. The first was made by Donatello, who of course reworked and reinvented almost every sculptural tradition available. Donatello's monument, however, was much more static. All 4 hooves of the horse were on the ground. Here we can see Verrocchio is bringing in his interest in movement and making a more dynamic monument. He's accomplished the tremendous technical feat of balancing this enormous weight of metal on the 3 legs of the horse so that he can show the battle charger in mid-stride. Likewise, Colleoni is shown in movement. His chest is twisted one way, his head twisted the other. This dynamism gives Colleoni a sense of psychological impact. There's a fury and determination in his face that combines both anatomical understanding with psychological understanding. A good deal of the early Renaissance can be understood as a balancing between Christian and classical values. And yet here, at the end of the 1400s, we have something new arising. This is studied directly from nature, and as such, we're dealing here with something that is proto-scientific. In other words, it was Verrocchio's student, Leonardo da Vinci, at the beginning of the High Renaissance, who put aside both classical and Christian texts and literature and decided to trust nothing other than what his own investigations told him were true. Amongst other things, then, it was Verrocchio's understanding and study of nature and his love of portraying complex psychological states of mind that opened up the doors for the High Renaissance.
In 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail on the famous voyage to the Americas that would earn him a place in history as the pioneer of a new age of exploration. The Western world was about to leave behind the Middle Ages and enter a new era of discovery. In Western art, too, a new age was dawning. The end of the 15th century marks the beginning of one of the finest periods of European art. This is the story of that brief era called the Renaissance.
The Renaissance is really the period when things certainly come together for art history. It's one of those moments we remember, like Impressionism, as being particularly important, because not only do we have patrons who are prepared to pay for art, but we have amazing artists who are prepared to produce the things which their patrons want them to do. I'm talking about figures like Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, Titian and Holbein, these great artists who worked for the famous princely and papal patrons of Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries.
This is Rome, the center of modern Italy. And of course, in ancient times, it was the center of the greatest empire that Europe had ever seen, the Roman Empire. Around 1500, the papacy was growing much stronger. Its wealth was increasing, and its popes became incredibly ambitious, both in terms of art and politics. Also at this time, through the rediscovery of classical literature, artists were beginning to be regarded as what we now call the genius. In other words, they had powers of a sort of divine frenzy that led them to be able to create at a level unheard of before in Gothic art. Artists such as Michelangelo, Bramante, and Da Vinci launched into enormously ambitious projects, many of them funded and backed by people such as the Pope. The word Renaissance means literally rebirth. What is reborn, of course, is the classical world of Rome and Greece.
Between the period of the end of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Renaissance, most thinking was developed around a theocratic point of view, where learning or an understanding of the world was based upon the idea of God's place in the world and how God informed the world and created the world so that we were all made within God's image. But gradually, as if some of the philosophical ideas of the classical world became more widely understood, an idea developed that the world could be seen through the eyes of humankind.
What made the Renaissance different from the preceding period was the idea that man was in control of his world. He could operate not exactly on an equal level with God, but he could work harmoniously with nature.
With man in the center, these artists could look out upon the world and see it afresh and to create visions of the world that man had never seen before. They learned how to idealize the figure. They learned about nature in a way that was almost scientific.
We have a move within the Renaissance, a rejection of the stiff formality, scholastic philosophies and dogmatism, towards an experimental spirit, if you like, an attempt to go out there, try things, see if they worked, to look at the world and play with the world.
And so it was that artists such as Michelangelo and Raphael were drawn to Rome, where they spent the bulk of their artistic career, here in the Eternal City.
This idea of rebirth was felt first not here in Rome, but 150 miles to the north, in the Tuscan city of Florence. An attractive, prosperous city today, Florence is famed the world over for its art galleries and museums, with hundreds of great works on display, created by artists who lived and worked here. The first of these great Florentine artists was Giotto, active around the beginning of the 14th century. It was early in the 15th century that Florentine artists collectively initiated what is now regarded as the early Renaissance. In an independent, outward-looking city, made wealthy by trade and commerce, a new fascination with the art and literature of the ancients began to develop. The discoveries and innovations of the artists of Florence soon began to spread throughout Italy, and eventually elsewhere in Europe. But throughout the 15th century, Florence retained its preeminence as an artistic center. It was into this culture that a teenage boy arrived around the mid-1460s. His family moved from a nearby Tuscan village where he was born. A precociously talented youth, he would take advantage of the opportunities for learning afforded by Florence and developed into one of the most admired and sought-after artists of his time, Leonardo da Vinci.
As a painter, Leonardo certainly did deserve his reputation. He was an innovator in all sorts of ways. And one of the significant things about his paintings is that he was moving from the very stiff, very formalised composition of paintings, which was current up to that point, to something much more fluid, much more evocative. The use of colours and the way he painted the colours. All of this suggested a much more fluid, experimental approach.
From an early age, Leonardo demonstrated an insatiable appetite for study, and the sheer breadth of his research can be seen in his surviving notebooks. He studied anatomy, astronomy, physics, geography, and engineering, amongst the other subjects that today are the preserve of single-subject professionals. He created designs for flying machines 400 years before the Wright brothers took to the air. But Leonardo was first and foremost an artist who soaked up the technical advances in art taking place in his lifetime. His unfinished Adoration of the Magi, now on display in the city's great Uffizi gallery, displays his early mastery of the new science of perspective and his dramatically solid, authentically posed figures, all arranged in the satisfying pyramid design which had been pioneered by Botticelli in his Adoration of the Magi, also in the Uffizi. Leonardo's Adoration would remain unfinished, however, since 1482 would see the young artist leave Florence to enter the service of Ludovico, Duke of Milan, where he would remain for 18 years. He worked as the Duke's chief engineer and architect, whilst at the same time working on sculptures and paintings. He continued to indulge his powerful passion for research, most notably his study of nature and the human body.
His explorations into science, into anatomy, into flight, into all these kind of branches of learning showed the way in which man was perceived to be able to be in control of his environment and to be in control of nature. This can be seen in Leonardo's painting of the Last Supper, which was regarded as a revolutionary work.
Leonardo's Last Supper was painted for the refectory of a monastery called Santa Maria delle Grazie, Santa Maria of the Graces in Milan. And it's a work which has been famed ever since the moment of its conception. People who were in Milan in the 15th century were commenting about its marvels. And it's really famous because it shows a very familiar subject in Christian iconography, the Last Supper. And this is the moment when Christ and his disciples are getting together before Christ is going to be betrayed by Judas.
Up to that point, artists would have treated the 12 apostles as isolated individuals, and they would each have been formally painted in their own right. But what Leonardo did was grouped them into dynamic groupings of 3, and these were arranged around the figure of Christ and framed the figure of Christ. So that the whole tenor of that painting, and it is truly a masterpiece, is a painting full of movement and full of life, which had hitherto not really been apparent in paintings of the period.
Here we see all of the apostles sitting, having their meal off the same refectory tables that the monks themselves eat off, and even the tablecloth was the same tablecloth. It's known that Leonardo actually requested these items so that he could construct his image on the same basis. It gives the monks the impression that they are having their meal at the same time that Christ is having the Last Supper.
I suppose the effect of it is heightened today by the fact that painting is in a parlous state of disrepair. It's in a complete mess, because Leonardo, although he was a great painter, was not a great technician. He didn't know how to paint fresco, which is the medium which this painting is on, straight onto the wall of the refectory where the monks ate. So it's been disintegrating gradually for the past couple of hundred years. But although this is very sad for the painting, it gives it this misty quality, which when you're looking at it makes it look even more evocative, romantic and emotional. So in a sense, the bad technique actually heightens the way the painting looks as an evocation of the Last Supper.
Soon after the completion of the Last Supper, Leonardo was forced to leave Milan when it fell to the armies of the French, and he returned to Florence in 1500. By 1502, he'd found himself a new patron, the tyrannical Cesare Borgia, the Duke of Romagna. Working principally as the Duke's architect and engineer, Leonardo also continued working on several portraits, although only one of them has survived to the present day. Now on display in the Louvre, Paris, it captures Leonardo's memory of a haunting smile he once found on a Florentine woman of his time.
The Mona Lisa is perhaps the most famous of Leonardo's paintings. It's in fact so famous it appears in images throughout the world, possibly more than any other painting that's ever been produced.
We're so used to seeing it in reproductions, on t-shirts, in ads, in anything, that we forget that actually it's a really, really tiny picture. It's very small. And who is it? That's the question that people always ask, because the lady in it has this famously enigmatic smile.
The significance of the Mona Lisa as a milestone in the history of art is that it shows consummate skill in two distinct techniques. The first one is called sfumato, and this is the infinitesimal grading of areas of colour into one another. And what this gives is a rather dewy picture, a smoke-filled scene, soft, without hard edges. And the second technique is called chiaroscuro, and this is the modelling of forms, the bringing of form onto the canvas by the use of light and shade, and the juxtaposition of light and shade to suggest solid form.
Leonardo is very keen on these strange, romantic, evocative landscapes, and the back of the Mona Lisa, like many of his other paintings, has these strange mountains and sights not known to man, but which came out of Leonardo's imagination. He was amazingly fertile. He kept all these diaries and notebooks in which he'd write down any idea he had. And he saw himself not just as a painter, but as an inventor and an engineer and just a great thinker. And I think that comes across in paintings like the Mona Lisa, which are more than a painting. They really are about an attitude of mind or of thought. It's a way of seeing into Leonardo himself, really.
The Mona Lisa, again, has a problem because in a sense it needs cleaning, but it's rather regarded almost as too valuable a painting even to touch, so that if it was cleaned, we perhaps would have a much more definitive view of how he constructs the recession within the paintings and things like that. But we now only have perhaps a part of the image because of this problem.
By the time of the creation of the Mona Lisa, Leonardo was already a legend, whose skills were sought by the great men of his age. Noblemen wanting portraits, civic leaders wanting advice on canal construction, generals wanting weapons. Leonardo's fame and genius meant that he had no shortage of projects to turn his mind to. In 1505, for example, in Florence, he was asked to join a committee of artists to decide where to place a new statue created by a 28-year-old Florentine contemporary. The statue concerned would become one of the most famous sculptures ever, and its creator a celebrated model of the Renaissance notion of divine inspiration. It was none other than Michelangelo. Michelangelo is the second of the great Florentine artists of the High Renaissance, and quite different from Leonardo.
Whereas Leonardo was placid, calm, easy to work with, Michelangelo, on the other hand, was difficult and tempestuous and had even proved to be too much for a pope.
Born in 1475 to a well-connected family, as a youth he was briefly apprenticed to Domenico Ghirlandaio, an important fresco painter of his day. After leaving Ghirlandaio, the young Michelangelo moved into the palace of Lorenzo de' Medici and its thriving intellectual environment dominated by the study of classical culture. Like Leonardo, he studied anatomy extensively while learning about the mathematical system of proportions used in classical art. Concerned from an early age with the artistic task of representing the human figure, Michelangelo's first preference was for marble sculpture.
Michelangelo saw the process of working with marble as a type of divinely inspired activity. We hear about Michelangelo attacking blocks of stone with nothing else to help him but his divinely inspired inspiration. However, other sources tell us that he actually worked painstakingly with his marble, and he saw this process as a way of setting free a type of spirit that was trapped within the block of stone.
Michelangelo was by far the greatest sculptor who ever lived. He lived for a full 87 years, and within that period he completely revolutionized the art of sculpture.
By 1504, he'd completed the sculpture whose location would be decided by Leonardo and others.
Like Donatello's St. George and the Dragon, David was another great hero of the Bible. Here, though, Michelangelo has used a much more classical style. He's made much greater study of anatomy and classical sculpture than Donatello was able to make. This is the high Renaissance style in which the idealization of the human figure is brought to its highest peak. Michelangelo has put this to great use in making one of the great symbols of the independence and heroic individual spirit of the Florentine Republic. In fact, when it was finished, it wasn't put on top of the cathedral as intended, but right here, down low, in front of the town hall. Ever since then, it's become a symbol of the Florentine Republic.
If this sculpture symbolizes the Republic, it does so because it achieves a plane of superhuman grandeur. It does not ignore faults, but ennobles them, thus remaining accessible and monumental. Moreover, it conveys an eternal image of spiritual courage and physical energy, without the need for a symbolic weapon.
Notice the posture in particular is very classical. It's called contrapposto. One side carries the weight and is about action. The other side is relaxed and is about thought. In this sculpture, Michelangelo combines action and reflection in a single sculpture that is self-sufficient.
Michelangelo's genius was now known throughout Italy and came to the attention of the new Pope, Julius II, one of the greatest art patrons of the Renaissance. The Palace of the Vatican, Rome, is home to a priceless collection of books, manuscripts, and artworks from throughout history. It consists of a complex of buildings, at the heart of which stands Michelangelo's dome, as a sign of the authority of the Church of Rome. Before designing this dome, however, Michelangelo worked in the tall open hall designed by Sixtus IV for the conduct of papal ceremonies. This Sistine Chapel was to be the location of one of the most extraordinary feats in Western art history. By the early 16th century, its walls had already been painted by artists such as Perugino and the great Botticelli, but the ceiling remained blank. It was Julius who proposed that this ceiling should be painted by Michelangelo. And although Michelangelo thought of himself primarily as a sculptor, he was reluctantly persuaded to take on the new challenge. In 4 years of solitary work between 1508 and 1512, lying on scaffolding flat on his back, Michelangelo used the technique of frescoing, applying paint to wet plaster, to produce a masterpiece of crisply rendered muscular figures. The Sistine Chapel ceiling remains one of the more memorable creations in Western art, but remarkably, it was not the only momentous art being produced in the papal palace at the time. In 1509, Pope Julius commissioned another series of frescoes for a suite of rooms within the Vatican. To carry out the work, he chose a 26-year-old artist who had trained in Perugia. He is now regarded as the third great artist of the Florentine High Renaissance, Raffaello Santi, or Raphael.
Raphael of Urbino was one of those very particular talents. he was a contemporary of Michelangelo's and of Leonardo. I don't think any of the three of them really got on. They were all such big artists that they felt they were, crowding each other out. But Raphael was from Urbino, which was near Florence, but the real moment in his career came when he went to Florence at the turn of the 16th century, where he was able to see the work that Michelangelo and Leonardo were doing in the council hall in Florence. He was very much influenced by that.
Raphael is often thought to be the pinnacle of all Renaissance artists, in that he combined all of the best parts of the other famous Renaissance painters without what was at one time considered their faults. Raphael's painting became, particularly in the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, almost the icon that artists were to aspire to.
Raphael's greatest achievement within the Vatican can be seen within a room known as the Stanza della Segnatura.
The subject matter for these frescoes was about the intellectual pursuit of man, such as theology, law, philosophy, a whole range of academic disciplines. This theme fitted in very well with the purpose of this room, which formed part of the suite of papal offices of Julius II. An important feature of this room was Raphael's School of Athens, whereby various philosophers exemplify their particular ideas and particular thoughts by their gestures and by their facial features.
Frescoes such as this, and others, such as the nymph Galatea, which can still be seen in Rome's Villa Farnese, would have been enough to secure him fame within his lifetime. But it is not for these that Raphael is best known, but for a series of paintings executed during his earlier period in Florence. Having arrived there at the age of 21, into an environment dominated by Leonardo and Michelangelo, he quickly produced a series of images of the Virgin Mary that have become a standard for such devotional work. A superb example of Raphael's Madonnas can be seen in the Uffizi in Florence. It's entitled The Madonna of the Goldfinch.
The Madonna of the Goldfinch, this was painted shortly before he left for Rome in 1508. It's a triangular composition that allows Raphael to create a completely stable, unified composition.
This painting was painted for a man called Lorenzo Nasi, who was a great familiar of Raphael's. And it's a little Madonna with Christ Child and St. John the Baptist. And it's a beautiful composition. It's very, very sympathetic. The Madonna has a lovely, lovely face. It's in a gorgeous setting. It's something to look at, which you would gain a lot from each time. But we also forget that it's a religious image. And this painting really was meant to show an apocryphal, that is a made-up moment from the Gospels, when the little baby John the Baptist was meant to have gone to baby Christ and asked him about the mystery of the Passion. And when he brought with him a goldfinch, which is a symbol of the Passion, and this painting with these two beautiful infants is meant to symbolise them both knowing that actually they're going to suffer horrific deaths for Christianity. So for people looking at the painting, they could appreciate the beauty of it and also the religious sentiment. So it had a twofold purpose.
It's a very, almost a sweet sort of image. It's an image which has come down to us as a kind of totem, almost, of what pictures of the Madonna are. And Raphael was the painter who was able to encapsulate this most within his painting.
Although Raphael's fame stemmed primarily from Madonnas such as this, and from his Vatican frescoes, he also executed several important oil paintings, notably of the two popes who patronized his work, Pope Julius II, whom he painted in 1511, and his successor as pontiff, Giovanni de' Medici, or Pope Leo X. But like his great Florentine contemporaries, Raphael's skills extended beyond painting, and in 1514 he was appointed chief architect of the new St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, by Leo X. In addition, he took charge of the excavations of classical ruins taking place in Rome at this time. By 1520, Raphael was a major figure in Rome, on intimate and influential terms with the Pope and his court. Tragically, in that same year, Raphael died suddenly on his 37th birthday, but having produced in his short lifetime some of the most memorable images of Western art. Raphael was the second of the great triumvirate of Florentine High Renaissance geniuses to die, the great Leonardo having died the previous year at the age of 67. By contrast, though, Michelangelo would survive for another 44 years, his greatest painting during this period taking place once more within the Sistine Chapel, between 1536 and 1541. This was his large fresco for the altar wall.
The Last Judgment, in fact, is the most apocalyptic of all of his paintings. So much so that when the painting was unveiled, the Pope was supposed to be actually terrified of the image. It was far more dramatic, far more emotional than he'd ever envisaged that it would be.
Traditionally, Last Judgments were very iconic. They showed Christ in glory and him sending people down to hell or up to heaven, depending on whether they'd been good or bad in their life. But Michelangelo's painting has got much more movement in it. It's full of life, things are happening all over the place. He puts in a scene from Dante's Divine Comedy, that's of Chiron, who was the ferryman bringing the souls of the damned over to hell. And that's actually from classical mythology, but Michelangelo incorporates it in The Last Judgment, which of course is in the centre of the papacy in Rome. And he also paints himself very curiously on the flayed skin of St. Bartholomew, a saint who'd been martyred most horribly by having his skin all cut off. And Michelangelo places himself there, which has been used as an example of what despair he might have been feeling when he was painting this Last Judgment, which he was very unhappy to be doing it. He was doing it as a great favour for the Pope.
His mind had very much darkened, his ideas had very much darkened from the period 20 years previously when he was painting the ceiling. When we look at the ceiling, it's a very affirmative image. It creates this sense of the greatness of God and the universe that he created. But The Last Judgment is a painting which underpins this notion of the frailty of mankind and of how judgment will come to all of us.
It was a commission which has lots of nudity in it, and after Michelangelo's death there was a movement, the Reformation was hitting Italy. It was called the Contra-Reformation, and a lot of the cardinals and people high up in the Catholic Church were not happy at all about the fact that there were all these naked men, like Christ himself, on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. So they sent other painters to paint them over with fig leaves, and these were just removed in the recent restoration. So now if you're in Rome you can see the painting in its true glory and in the beautiful harmony of the blue and rose colours that Michelangelo originally designed.
Michelangelo continued to produce unrivaled work and would continue to sculpt until a few days before his eventual death at the age of 89 in 1564, by which time the relationship between man and God was beginning to change. This changing relationship had expressed itself most strongly across the Alps from Italy in northern Europe. The Reformation of the Church, heralded by the German Martin Luther in 1517 with his publication of his 95 Theses, would eventually end the universal authority of the Pope in ecclesiastical matters in Europe and lead to the establishment of the Protestant churches. This emerging Protestant culture produced its own masters, most famously Albrecht Dürer. Born in Nuremberg in 1471, the son of a goldsmith who was also an artist of some note, Dürer began his creative life in his hometown's thriving new print industry, producing woodcut illustrations for books. At 20, he made the first of his 4 great journeys through northwest Europe, illustrating books along the way. He absorbed the tradition of the northern artists, which had developed almost entirely independently of Italian influence. 15th century northern artists such as Jan van Eyck and Roger van der Weyden created works whose beauty derived from careful observation of reality, applied in great detail, usually with the new oil paint technique pioneered by Van Eyck. This tradition can be seen in Dürer's simple but wonderfully natural picture of a hare. But Dürer was also aware of the momentous developments going on in Italian art, and after marriage and setting up his own workshop, he spent a year in Italy.
Dürer is a very interesting character because although at first glance his works may appear to have a specifically northern character, the time which he spent in Italy and the time in which he was able to study the engravings of Mantegna ensured that the Italian interest in naturalism and a realistic depiction of space and form allowed him to blend 2 influences to create a style particularly unique to him.
His woodcut of Adam and Eve from 1504 perhaps best illustrates these efforts. However, his self-portrait of 1498, more wholly in the northern tradition, is for many a more significant work, since it proudly proclaims the status of the artist as a humanist scholar rather than just a manual worker. If Dürer was concerned about the lack of status granted to artists in the north, he needn't have worried. His many prints ensured that he became well known across Europe. When he returned to Italy in 1505 for 2 years, he discovered copies of his prints were widely available. He was also pleased to enjoy the high status granted to artists in Italy compared to Germany. "Here I am treated as a great man," he wrote to a friend, "at home as a poor devil." Dürer's work from this period, notably his Madonna of the Rose Garlands in Prague, was heavily influenced by the Venetian Giovanni Bellini, and they confirm Dürer's capacity to mix northern and Italian art.
He begins to adopt a more sculptural approach. He begins to use shading and use line to create a sense of depth, a sense of roundness, which in spite of his use of harsh line and almost jagged northern forms, allows him to create a greater sense of depth and a greater sense of space within the environment which he depicts.
Dürer is often regarded as the great artist of the Reformation, and his ardent support for Martin Luther is well documented. But although the age of Protestantism was seen by many in Northern Europe as a great step forward for humanity, the Reformation would have an unfortunate consequence for some artists: less work. Many thinkers of the Reformation considered the visual arts to be a form of forbidden idolatry. As their ideas took hold in regions such as Switzerland, the artist's traditional role in painting religious images for churches went into decline. If the artists were to thrive, they would have to find new roles. One such role was that of portraiture, and in Northern Europe, the greatest portraitist of his age was Hans Holbein.
Hans Holbein the Younger was the son of another painter, and in fact he was trained as a goldsmith. He mostly worked in his early life in Basel in Switzerland, and he produced illustrations for printers, but with the Reformation making life rather turbulent in Europe at the time, he came to London.
Holbein eventually became the court painter to Henry VIII, and set about producing a series of portraits that capture the spirit of that tumultuous era in English history. The attention to detail, characteristic of the Northern European tradition, can be seen not only in his surviving portraits of the king and his later wives, but also in his images of the courtiers and merchants of the time. Portraits whose elegant simplicity seem to capture the spirit and attitude of the subject. The National Gallery in London is home to one of his best-known portraits, The Ambassadors.
It represents the ambassador to France in 1533, a man called D'Anville, and his friend who was a bishop called Georges de Selve. And Selve probably came to visit his friend D'Anville in London in April or May 1533, and the painting is a very, very important sort of, it's like saying this meeting happened. It shows what they did when they were in London. And it really tells us a bit about the men who were members of the French nobility, very, very, very high up, and their interests, because the painting is very famous for the number of objects it represents between these two figures.
What we see in the painting are images of globes which show their worldly power and influence. We see books, one of which is entitled Arithmetic for Merchants. We see the latest theological treatise from Martin Luther. We see all of their ideas within this Renaissance world that they inhabit. And yet also what we see is a lute on the lower shelf behind them. Curiously, the lute has a broken string, which has a rather deeper meaning.
And the main feature of this painting, apart from the two men, is the strange distorted skull in the centre of the image right on the floor. And the curious thing about this skull is that you can only see it properly from an angle, and it would be seen as if you were coming up a stairs and suddenly you would see the skull in front of you. You wouldn't see it, and suddenly there it would be there. So it's a very sudden, immediate response that someone looking at the painting would see.
What all of these details are telling us is that life in itself is still transient. So that Holbein tells us both that the two people he paints are the members of the very pinnacle of society, but also that they, along with all of the rest of us, are mortal men, and that life will pass.
If Holbein was the undoubted master portraitist of his age in Northern Europe, among Italian artists of the time, that honor goes to Titian, who hailed not from Florence, but from Venice. Venetian art of the Renaissance period was inaugurated by Giovanni Bellini.
I have here behind me a wonderful painting by Bellini, painted in oil on panel. It shows a sacred conversation between two saints and the Virgin Mary. The donor who paid for the painting is shown kneeling in the foreground. It shows the influence of northern painting, particularly in the way in which he's treated the edges with a softer line, and the way in which he's given the landscape great depth and subtlety of rendering. The colors are rich and bright, in keeping with the Venetian tradition of capturing strong light and delicate shading.
Born around 1480, the young Titian studied with Bellini, where he absorbed his master's ideas on color and space in a series of large altarpieces.
In 1517, just as the Roman High Renaissance came crashing down, Titian produced his Assumption of the Virgin for the friars here at St. Mary's in Venice. It's a monumental canvas and established his reputation as a young man.
Now the subject in this painting is the Assumption of the Virgin, and this is the moment when the Virgin Mary is taken up into heaven and is reunited with her son as the Queen of Heaven. Now Titian's painting is amazingly dramatic, but what's great about the painting is there's this pyramidic movement in the centre of it, of the Virgin and the saints who are watching her ascension below her, staring up at her. So the painting is very, very strong, and it's just stunningly beautiful. Bright colours, blues for which the Venetians were particularly famed. So the blues and the reds make this painting even more dramatic than it would be otherwise.
What Titian then did was he painted a much more dynamic image than had ever been produced before. The prior German of the Church of the Frari, he was expecting a rather calm Renaissance image. What he got was a Baroque painting, but it was a Baroque painting painted 100 years before the Baroque period actually began.
Titian's way of painting is very different to the Central Italian way of painting of Michelangelo and Raphael. The Venetians were very, very keen on colour, on texture, on landscape, whereas in Central Italian painting you're more likely to find strong emotion and movement. And as a result, we tend to think of the Venetians today as not being as good painters as Michelangelo and Raphael.
Like other high Renaissance painters, who lived well on into the 1500s, Titian began to play with high Renaissance stability and composition. For his painting St. Mary with Saints, with the Pizarro family, also here in St. Mary's of the Friars in Venice, he put the Virgin acentrically on the canvas, placing her to one side. This striking new composition raised quite a few eyebrows, and indeed it led critics to observe that Titian, just as Michelangelo, could have his mannerist tendencies.
Despite his fame, which lasted until his death, it's possible that Titian's status as the leading Venetian artist of the Renaissance would not have been achieved if one of his contemporaries had not died so tragically young. Giorgio Barbarelli, known as Giorgione.
This is the Accademia Bridge in Venice, and nearby are some of the best works by Giorgione. Giorgione was a contemporary of Titian, though he only lived until his mid-30s. Nevertheless, Giorgione sees the world through very different eyes than his master, Bellini.
The Sleeping Venus is the first painting of modern times to take as its subject matter the female nude set against a landscape. And Titian borrowed the pose wholesale for his own classic nude 3 decades later.
Giorgione and Titian are very interesting artists for the fact that they had the same teacher, Bellini. Giorgione was significant because he introduced a new theme to Italian art. He introduced more secular and pagan themes, such as love and even eroticism. Giorgione introduced the female nude, which was to be fundamental for the rest of Western art.
Giorgione's greatest work, The Tempest, in the Galleria dell'Accademia in Venice, is especially interesting for 2 reasons. Firstly, Giorgione used a new type of highly opaque oil paint that he had developed. This new paint enabled modifications to be made during the actual act of painting. We know this for sure in the case of The Tempest, because X-rays have revealed that where the soldier now stands, there was once a second female nude. The second innovation relates to the subject matter of the work. If the painting illustrates a story, no record of that story survives.
The woman and child in the painting may indeed be a virgin and child, and yet it's highly ambiguous and enigmatic. What we have here is perhaps the appearance of a more humanist sensibility in Venetian painting. The storm that's brewing in the sky behind these figures is threatening, and it seems to place man at the center of concerns. Nature is not seen or interpreted here through Christian symbolism. Giorgione, therefore, is enormously important. He struck up a new aesthetic in painting that involves landscapes and figures in a picturesque scene that is both moving and beautiful at the same time.
That the artists of the High Renaissance were able to achieve so much in such a short period of time perhaps gives us as good an indication as any of the vitality of the times in which they lived. The High Renaissance remains remarkable for achieving a more human and a more superhuman image of man. While the politics of the age were far from ideal, the arts in Florence and Rome compensated with awe-inspiring glimpses of a perfect world of grace, harmony, and heroic beauty. In Venice and Northern Europe, the early 15th century presented a moment in which man's most complex emotions were conveyed with clarity and dignity. Inspired by classical culture, the masters of the Renaissance created works which continue to invite and haunt man's most profound aspirations.
Of all the periods of the history of Western art, the Renaissance period of the early 16th century can still legitimately claim to be the greatest of them all. The artistic discoveries and achievements of men such as Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Titian, amongst many others, were so significant that it is perhaps understandable that many of the artists who followed them in the later 1500s could do little more than work in the style or manner of these great masters, especially the later Michelangelo. This was the age of mannerism, a period which saw the creation of much fine art, but a period that would quickly be superseded across Europe by a far more significant age, the age of the Baroque. The word derives from the Portuguese word barroco, meaning an irregularly shaped pearl. We can be sure, however, that by the end of the 18th century, the word was being used by art critics in a derogatory sense to describe the art of the previous century, which many considered to be, at best, decadent, and at worst, irrelevant. These widespread opinions would not last, however, and the art of the Baroque age, corresponding roughly to the 17th century, is now considered to be one of the most interesting in art history.
Baroque painting and sculpture breaks the rules which we've seen in previous painting. We get perhaps far more dramatic kind of compositions where there are extremes of light and dark, from spotlit drama to deep, deep shadows. We break away from Renaissance, painted on a stage set. We become participants and spectators much closer in a drama which is taking place before us. An increase in scale and an increased palette and perhaps more vigorous brushwork too.
The return to Baroque signals almost a return to a natural sort of format, a realistic sort of settings with contemporary people interacting with religious scenes. You get this extension outwards of space and its versatility. Characteristics are the quality of light, the quality of color.
The birthplace of the Baroque age in art can be traced not to Northern Europe, where these changes in society were perhaps the most pronounced, but to Rome, at the end of the 16th century, and the work of two artists who produced their greatest work there, Carracci and Caravaggio. Born in Bologna in 1560, Annibale Carracci was a member of a family of talented artists who founded the first modern art academy in their home city, a significant development in itself. For the first time in the modern age, art technique was formally taught to students. But Annibale Carracci would prove himself a master when he moved to Rome in 1595 to take on a truly enormous commission: to fresco the gallery ceiling in the Palazzo Farnese with love scenes of pagan gods, as described by the Roman poet Ovid. It would be a 7-year labor that would make Carracci's name, Just to execute such a work on this scale represents an enormous achievement. But the actual figures depicted by Carracci are especially significant to the art historian. They are undeniably human, free of the stylistic distortion of form that characterized much of the Mannerist art of the time. The second of the important Italian artists of the early Baroque was born Michelangelo Merisi in 1573 in a small North Italian town which would give him the name by which we know him today, Caravaggio. Like his compatriot Carracci, Caravaggio moved to Rome as a young artist and quickly became known not just to fellow artists and patrons, but to the magistrates and officers of the law. Temperamental, with a propensity for violence that in 1606 led to his being charged with murder, it was perhaps this strong individualistic streak of Caravaggio's that informed his undoubted artistic masterpieces, the greatest of which depict religious subject matter.
He used very, very strong contrast of light and dark. He highlighted pictures so that almost the figures, the drama, almost kind of lit by a stage light. All extraneous detail is excluded, so our eyes are focused on the human drama of the scene.
His enthusiasm for depicting humanity as it appeared to his eye would prove inspirational to Baroque artists across Europe. As the 17th century progressed, however, Italian Baroque artists began to develop a particularly grandiose style, inspired once again by the papacy, who looked for suitable pomp and splendor to glorify the Catholic Church. One of the main individuals of this era is considered by many to be the greatest figure of the Baroque era in Italy, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, a master of painting and architecture, but particularly sculpture. Born in 1598, Bernini's role in the development of Baroque Rome and the creation of the grand Italian style was central, and he won commissions from many monarchs and religious leaders of the period. Much of Bernini's work was related to the building of St. Peter's in Rome, continued from the previous century. With his 100-foot-high bronze altar canopy over the altar of St. Peter's, commissioned by Pope Urban VIII, Bernini blurred the boundaries between sculpture and architecture in a remarkable display of grandeur. His work was obviously very much in keeping with the Church's requirements. Urban VIII was only the first of 7 popes for whom Bernini would work. But perhaps the finest example of Bernini's work, and one which encapsulates many of the themes of the Baroque, is another sculpture that can still be seen in Rome. It is the Ecstasy of St. Teresa, a marble 3 meters high in the Cornaro Chapel of the Church of Santa Maria della Vittoria. It represents a visionary nun of the 16th century who, in one of her spiritual experiences, imagined being joyfully pierced by an arrow from an angel's bow. A work full of movement and intensity, notably in the tortured and ecstatic expression of the saint herself, it is Bernini's use of light that is the piece's most remarkable feature. By positioning the marble in front of rays of bronze below an invisible window through which the light pours, Bernini creates an utterly compelling illusion of light descending from heaven. Perhaps more than any other work, the Ecstasy of St. Teresa expresses the flavor of Italian Baroque. But to the north, in Protestant Holland, the situation for the visual artist was very different from that in Flanders and the rest of Catholic Europe. The Protestant churches were utterly opposed to the patronage of visual art, interpreting such images as graven and forbidden by Scripture. So, artists in Holland, for instance, increasingly had to look for new ways to make a living. Since altarpieces and church ceilings, to name but 2 commissions favored by the Catholic Church, were no longer required, Dutch artists were compelled to focus on portraits, landscapes, seascapes, still life, anything, in fact, that the artist considered sellable. Although this meant poverty for many unsuccessful artists, this expansion of subject matter considered suitable as art would prove ultimately to be a liberating development. Born in 1606 in the Dutch town of Leiden, Rembrandt van Rijn spent the bulk of his working life in Amsterdam, where many of his greatest works can be seen today. Although such is the volume and quality of his lifetime oeuvre, it is difficult for the would-be explorer of Rembrandt to know where to start. It may be that his portraits provide the best starting point. Rembrandt's skill as a portraitist, however, is perhaps best illustrated by his images of himself, his self-portraits. Time and again he rendered his own image on the canvas, over 60 times in total, creating in the process a visual history of the life of the artist. At no point does he ever attempt to present himself on the canvas as anything other than what he was, a physically imperfect man. It is perhaps because of this great series of portraits that so many people feel a close personal affinity with Rembrandt's work. Despite his financial difficulties, Rembrandt was undoubtedly the giant of 17th century Dutch art. But, perhaps because of the specific nature of the art market in Holland, he was not the only fascinating artist at work at the time. With the absence of religious commissions, still life painting began to grow in popularity, a genre whose greatest exponent was probably Willem Cuyp. Landscapes, too, would provide work for the Dutch artist, and Jacob van Ruysdael's view of Haarlem takes the modern viewer straight back to the flatlands of 1670s Holland. But perhaps more interesting than these fine works are the creations of the final great artist of the 17th century, Jan Vermeer. If Rembrandt's was the most prodigious output of the 17th century Dutch masters, then there can be little doubt that Jan Vermeer's was the least. Just 35 canvases of his can be seen today, including some portraits and landscapes. But for his most significant work, Vermeer chose to depict simple domestic scenes, utterly unremarkable in themselves, but transformed by Vermeer into art that delights to this day. A calm approach to the distribution of light, a precise approach to color, and, perhaps most significantly, a superb arrangement of space can be seen in images like Young Woman with a Water Jug and The Kitchen Maid Pouring Milk. But it is this elevation of the human, the ordinary, everyday human, to center stage in what is undoubtedly fine art, that is, by far, the most significant aspect of Vermeer's work. And although some critics suggest that Vermeer is not in the strictest sense an artist of the Baroque, it is perhaps appropriate that his paintings of real humans doing real things in real places should conclude any journey through the Baroque period, a period that, as we have seen, was integral to the evolution of art.
Literature does not exist in isolation. It is shaped by social and cultural change. The style of poetry that emerged in the early 17th century was a response to the spirit of the age. In a period when many traditions were being challenged, new patterns of thought and feeling formed. Scientific advances had challenged established ideas about the Earth's place in the universe. A mood of anxiety, created as old certainties faded, was heightened by divisive religious and political upheavals. These changes threatened the status quo and the concept of the divine right of kings. The early years of the 17th century lay between two major upheavals in English society, the Reformation and the Civil War. These cataclysmic events were part of the process of transition which transformed society from medieval to modern.
Then there was the increasing impact of new discoveries, both geographical discoveries from across the world and ideas on the structure of the universe. The old ideas of the Ptolemaic universe, which saw the Earth as a centre, was now generally known to have been replaced by Copernicus's theories that the sun was the centre of the universe. And this was such a shocking idea that people reacted as if the universe had actually been reorganised, not merely we had a different theory about it. So it could be used as an image of dissolution, of destruction, and there was much talk of the coming of the end of the world, partly as a result of that. So it's a very exciting period to live in, and all these influences and pressures are there in the poetry.
Metaphysical poetry deals most frequently with issues central to this uncertain world. Although love, in its many forms, is a major theme, the poets also address the progress of the soul, religion, and the state. One of the characteristic literary devices used by the metaphysical poets is the conceit. This is a piece of imagery which unites disparate objects and sustains their apparent likeness throughout the poem. Donne's poem, A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, is the source of one particularly well-known conceit, the comparison of lovers to a pair of compasses.
If they be two, they are two so as stiff twin compasses are two. Thy soul, the fixed foot, makes no show to move, but doth if the other do.
Donne is the most renowned of the metaphysical poets. His poetry is memorable for its wide-ranging exploration of love in its various forms, be that divine, sexual, or platonic. Donne conveys the intimate world of complete sexual love in The Good Morrow.
And now good morrow to our waking souls, which watch not one another out of fear, for love all love of other sights controls, and makes one little room and everywhere. Let sea discoverers to new worlds have gone, let maps to others worlds on worlds have shown. Let us possess one world, each hath one and is one.
Donne's treatment of love is complex and varied. He interlinks different forms of love. Religious and sexual love in particular are blended in his poetry. Lovers become spiritual figures as their relationship rises from the physical.
At its most profound level, Platonic love transcends the body and moves on to a kind of divine love, as Bembo states in Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier. The lover is supposed to look at the mistress's soul as much as he looks at her body.
In his third satire, Donne confronts the religious turmoil of the age. By encouraging a search for the true religion, he charts the progression of religious practice. The poem moves from the history of the Catholic Church founded in Rome to the emergence of Calvinism with its Northern European roots. This journey mirrors Donne's personal religious progression.
Having been brought up as a Roman Catholic and then becoming an Anglican with an emphasis on a Calvinist attitude, I think he found this a very tense area. The Calvinist idea was that you were predestined for salvation or not, and the individual was supposed to strive hard to be good in order to discover which fate was meted out to them. I think it's a very uncomfortable belief, and Donne seems to have agonised over his relationship to God, if we take the poems personally, which I think we often should.
His poems do not concentrate simply on the outward manifestation of faith. They also address the progress of his own soul and express doubts about his relationship with God. These are most clearly seen in his divine poems.
O God, O of thine only worthy blood, and my tears make a heavenly Lethean flood, and drown in it my sin's black memory. That thou remember them, some claim as debt. I think it mercy, if thou wilt forget.
In the Divine Meditations, we find a period of Donne's reflection on his own sinfulness and on his need for salvation. Now, Donne, however, is never self-effacing, not even in these poems. He's constantly at the center of his own attention. The only constant habit he can discover in himself is that he's in fact inconstant.
In what was undoubtedly a golden age for drama, it is not surprising that Donne's poetry reflects the influences of those dramatists who were his contemporaries. The style of Donne's poetic voice is allied to the dramatic language of these playwrights. Many of his poems have startling and dramatic openings that immediately involve the reader.
For God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love, or chide my palsy or my gout.
I do not think melodramatic is an appropriate term to attach to Donne. He exaggerates sometimes, but to me melodrama suggests emotion or excitement in excess of the situation being described. What I would say, though, is he is a very dramatic poet.
The conversational quality of the dialogue and the powerful imagery which permeates much of Donne's work takes us beyond the confines of the poem. The reader is able to envisage the action being played out. In his poem, The Flea, Donne creates a whole scene from a conversation in which he attempts to prevent his lover killing a flea.
Oh, stay, 3 lives in 1 flea spare, where we almost, nay, more than married are. This flea is you and I, and this our marriage bed and marriage temple is.
The poem is ultimately about the narrator trying to persuade his mistress to sleep with him. The first stanza centers on the flea. In the second stanza, the mistress is threatening the flea. And in the third stanza the flea is squashed by the mistress. Now, the narrator tries to plead for the life of the flea and rebukes his mistress for killing the animal. The mistress is never allowed to speak, but we can gather her words and actions from the narrator's words. So a little drama evolves here within the poem, and it's really not a simple soliloquy or monologue, but a well-constructed drama.
The early 17th century was an age which created a new framework of ideas about man, society, and nature. Although Donne was not a philosopher, his poetry explores the issues which dominated the years in which he wrote. His poetic style of debate was a perfect vehicle for his pursuit of resolutions to disturbing issues. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the work of the metaphysical poets became unfashionable. Their reputation was revived in the early 20th century. An ingenious use of ideas and language, as well as their ability to sustain a close line of argument, appealed to modern poets. The ability of the metaphysical poets to express the experience of loving links them to poetry throughout the centuries. Human love is an enduring theme. What distinguishes the treatment of love by the metaphysical poets is its use as an overarching theme within which they addressed the major issues of their age.
The young prince was the eldest son of the pretender, James, and his Polish wife, Klementyna Sobieska. Growing up in the cosmopolitan world of the exiled Stuart court was certainly a colourful existence, and the young prince and his brother, Henry, benefited from a wealth of varied experiences, which produced a strong, fit young man who loved to ride, hunt, play music and dance, all of which he mastered with equal ease. He may well have received an excellent schooling, but as he grew into manhood, the prince did reveal a couple of worrying traits, which were never to leave him. The first was his profligacy. He spent lavishly on himself, always dressing in the finest clothes, and loving nothing better than to have his portrait painted. The Stuart household accounts for 1743, for example, show that Charles's personal expenditure was 3 times as much as his brother and 10 times as much as his father. Despite his flaws, Charles grew up to become a fit, handsome and athletic young man. So he was physically prepared for action and hardship when the distant prospect of regaining the throne of Britain flickered back to life. In 1744, Britain and France became embroiled in yet another war, and despite all their previous experiences, some Scots Jacobites were planning yet another rising. Now nearly 60 years of age, the old pretender wisely passed up the prospect of a further forlorn attempt at his elusive prize. However, James considered French military help a distinct possibility, and the 24-year-old Prince Charles, with the rashness of youth, was prepared to stake everything on one last throw of the dice. Charles left Rome and slipped into France in the hope that his presence would provoke the French king, Louis, into action on behalf of the Stuarts. He was to be disappointed. In the year he spent in France, the prince never once met Louis. Louis XV of France continually refused to grant Charles an audience. In the end, Charles was reduced to writing to Louis, begging for a meeting.
After having tried in vain all methods of reaching your Majesty, in the hope of obtaining the help necessary to enable me to play a role worthy of my birth, I have resolved to make myself known by my actions, and to undertake alone a project to which even a small amount of help would guarantee success.
Suddenly, in 1744, there was a glimmer of hope. The French unexpectedly sanctioned and prepared an invasion in support of the Stuarts. A French fleet sailed, with Charles aboard, but after a fierce storm sank some of their transports, it returned to France, and the young prince was consigned to a frustrating year ashore. Charles Edward Stuart was clearly not a man to take a hint. Frustrated beyond endurance, he resolved to raise the money himself to finance a small expedition to Scotland and lead another rebellion in his father's name. The rash adventure had begun. Landing with only 7 companions at Eyck on the west coast of Scotland, the prince did not give the appearance of a man about to lead a triumphant crusade. The larger of his 2 ships had been intercepted and attacked by British warships, but the clan chiefs grudgingly agreed to support a rising in the belief that they would be assisting a coming invasion by French regular troops. Here at Glenfinnan, on the 19th of August 1745, the prince's standard was raised, more in hope than expectation. At first, it seemed none would come. Then, in a fairy tale moment, like an episode from a romantic novel, the sound of pipes were heard echoing down the empty glen. Much against their better judgment, here were Cameron of Lochiel, the MacDonalds of Glengarry, the men of Keepock, and the young Clan Ranald and his followers. The rising had begun. Once raised, the prince's small army marched on Edinburgh. As they marched southward, additional numbers came in, swelling the ranks to 1,200 men. And suddenly there was hope, where there had only been uncertainty. As the prince could spare no men to garrison the city, on the 1st of November 1745, Edinburgh was abandoned, and the invasion of England begun. The army marched on London, against the expressed wishes of almost all the Highland chiefs. The invasion progressed rapidly. By avoiding Hawley's strong government army at Newcastle, the Jacobites were soon in control of Manchester. Despite the fact that church bells rang and crowds came to cheer, the prince was devastated to find that there were pitifully few volunteers prepared to actually join the rebellion. less than 300 of his prospective English subjects actually joined the prince's army. The Duke of Cumberland, with the second government army, more than twice the size of Charles's, tried to intercept the Jacobites near Lichfield, but they bypassed him too, and by the 4th of December were at Derby, only 120 miles from London. There, the young pretender and his officers argued for 2 days about what to do next. Charles was for pushing on to London, but the others disagreed. The French had not landed, and that crucially there was no sign of real support from the English population. In the end, Charles had to accept their decision, but he evermore considered himself betrayed by the Highland chiefs. Their differences would ultimately escalate into all-out war.
The main reason why the Council of War decided to turn back was the absence of English support and the belief that the reiterated promises of Charles about French and English support were in fact wildly over-optimistic, not to say downright misleading.
With the fateful decision to turn north, the Jacobite cause had reached its high watermark. On the 6th of December, the small army turned around and began retreating northwards. The conquering heroes were now treated with scorn and derision by the same crowds who had cheered them so heartily. For the Duke of Cumberland, this was the last straw. He now set out to destroy the prince's cause once and for all. His army was powerful and well equipped. Crucially, he could also call on 3 times as many troops as Charles. Cumberland was not to be deterred. His sudden advance caught the Jacobite army by surprise, and there was no real option left but to fight. To reach the government forces, the Highlanders had to charge across an open expanse of moorland, all the while exposed to the cannons and muskets of well-drilled opponents. Most Highlanders did not even reach the government lines.
At Culloden, though, it all went wrong. Partly because the Highlanders had a long way to go. As you can see there, that red flag more or less marks where this started off from. So it's 500 metres down to where the government force is standing. The regulars didn't panic. The Highlanders came rushing up, expecting the redcoats to run away, and they didn't. They stood there, they shot them, they shot them, and they shot them.
The full weight of the Highland attack fell upon just 2 government regiments, Barrel's and Monroe's. In the brief struggle which followed, 200 government soldiers were killed or wounded in a vicious hand-to-hand fight. But for the first time, the discipline of the government troops held firm, and despite the ferocity of the Highlanders' attack, the prince's men were soon halted. Just as quickly, they turned to fight. In the space of those terrible minutes, 800 clansmen were killed or wounded. It was at about this time that Prince Charles himself made his escape. Lord Elcho, the leader of his own bodyguard, is alleged to have called bitterly after him, "Run, you cowardly Italian." With Elcho's cry ringing in his ears, he rode off the field with a small escort of French cavalry to look to his own destiny. Finally, Charles was able to escape to France, suffering the ignominy of having to disguise himself as a woman to do so. Flora MacDonald was the woman who helped him. Contrary to popular opinion, no love was lost between them, and she paid the price for helping the prince, with a year in jail. Safely back in France, Charles assumed the role of society hero. He was cheered and applauded wherever he went. But King Louis, who now sought peace with England, considered the prince to be a political embarrassment. He was incensed to hear of Charles basking in the public adoration, visiting the opera, and preening himself in public, despite Louis's explicit instruction for him to remain incognito.
He wouldn't leave France, and Louis had to have him kidnapped at the opera and forcibly exiled. That was felt bitterly by Charles Edward, by his supporters, and by the French public, for whom Charles Edward was a hero.
Charles was now back in Italy. Like the cause he espoused, the affairs of Prince Charles Edward had reached their high watermark. The rest of his life was a slow decline into obscurity and alcoholism. There is something terribly poignant about the legendary figure, who will forever be celebrated as a dazzling young man, slipping into old age, senility, and drunkenness. Perhaps it would have been better if he had not sought to save his own skin and been killed at Culloden with his men. Then, at least, he would have been revered forever, the bonny Prince Charlie of legend.
The music of Antonio Vivaldi is best known to us through just one of his compositions, The Four Seasons. Yet there are well over 500 other works that survive: sonatas, symphonies, concertos. He also wrote a considerable number of operas and oratorios, but it is as a composer of instrumental music that he is chiefly remembered. He was born in Venice in 1678, the son of a barber who was also an accomplished violinist, apparently one of the best in the city. Antonio also played the violin. The continual mixing with other musicians, playing alongside and eventually deputizing for his father in the orchestra at St. Mark's, provided an ideal musical atmosphere in which his talents could develop. But, surprise, surprise, he decided not to take up music as a profession, but embarked upon a career in the church, becoming ordained as a priest in 1703. Within a year, on account of ill health, a chest complaint, probably asthma, he left the church and embarked upon the career that was to make him one of the most famous of Venetian composers, a maestro indeed. His first employment as a musician was to teach violin at the Ospedale della Pietà, an orphanage and conservatory in Venice. It was an all-female institution. I suppose the fact that he was also a priest helped persuade those that appointed him that he was, as it were, morally safe. He must have been. He was employed at the Pietà for most of his life, although he was dismissed and reinstated with alarming regularity, perhaps on account of his stormy and difficult personality. He did have a shock of red hair and was referred to as the Red Priest. The girls of the Pietà sang and played one or more instruments: violin, organ, flute, oboe, bassoon, even trumpet. Vivaldi thus had at his disposal a permanent orchestra of the highest standard that inspired him to experiment with form and orchestration, the results of which were to have a profound effect on the development of music in the whole of the 18th century. By the time he had completed his first two sets of compositions, his style was set and remained more or less unchanged for the rest of his life.
The lyricism of Vivaldi's music owes much to his surroundings. In the early 18th century, when Vivaldi was an active composer, Venice was celebrated for its extraordinary beauty. It was unique, and not just in its buildings. The Venetian attitude to life was very different. In marked contrast to the repressive climate which prevailed in the rest of Europe, Venice was openly carnal, indulgent, and libertine. At carnival time, the whole city would give itself over to wild abandon. For days on end, all manner of madness and indiscretions were openly permitted. People danced, sang, ate, revelled, gambled, and made love throughout the city. Music and love of music flourished in such a climate. Vivaldi was unable to resist the lure of the carnival as inspiration for this piece. His music reflects the exuberance and the excitement. The jovial tone of the two mandolins as they trade melodies perfectly captures the spirit of playful interaction characterized by carnival.
Vivaldi was now in demand as a soloist, and with his reputation established in Venice, it wasn't long before his fame spread abroad. His music was published in Venice, Paris, Amsterdam, and London. Having excelled as a composer of instrumental music, he turned his attention to opera, producing his first one in Vicenza in 1713. It was a great success, and he went on to write many more. He also saw a way to make even more money. He was obsessed with it. He promoted the operas himself. He became not only the maestro, but also the impresario. He travelled extensively, certainly to Amsterdam, Vienna, and Prague, for the purposes of promoting his operas. He was accompanied on his travels by a singer, Anna Giraud. She was apparently very pretty, but not highly rated as a singer, although, predictably, she was usually cast in the leading roles in his operas. Her sister, Peolina, went on the road with them as well, probably as a nurse for Vivaldi. Although he denied any impropriety, tongues do wag, you know, I don't think he would have risked the attendant scandal over a period of 14 years or so on the road without enjoying some of its fruits. But who knows? However, before he began this period of his life, he had written The Four Seasons, using all the tricks of the composer's trade and his not inconsiderable skills as an orchestrator to paint pictures with sound, and very convincingly too. Mind you, he took the precaution of prefacing each piece with a sonnet describing that particular season, and then marked the appropriate moments corresponding to the words in each concerto. Birdsong, depicted by happy little trills, violin tremolandi, marking the approach of thunder, pizzicati describing falling raindrops, and so on. Together with Pachelbel's celebrated canon and Albinoni's adagio for organ and strings, The Four Seasons are among the favourite items in the Baroque repertoire.
The famous suite of concertos popularly known as the Four Seasons is comprised of 4 separate violin concertos. Vivaldi wrote each to represent a specific season. In this piece, he represents the harsh winters of northern Italy. Vivaldi was only too aware of his inspiration and sought to describe in music what he thought it was like to shiver icily in the freezing dark in the teeth of a cruel wind. Vivaldi could compose with extraordinary speed. No doubt this ability contributed to Vivaldi's vast output. in 1715, he claimed to have written 10 concertos in only 3 days. This speed has also produced marked criticism. Vivaldi was not above repeating phrases in more than one composition. Stravinsky noted, "Vivaldi is greatly overrated, a dull fellow who composes the same form over and so many times over." A critic observed that he was an excellent violinist, but a mediocre composer. But the endearing qualities of the work meant Vivaldi had the last word. The violin tells a story.
Like so many composers that followed him, Vivaldi died in poverty. He had gone to Vienna in June 1741 to make some money, in fact, to sell some more concertos. He died there a month later and was buried the same day with a minimum of expense, as was Mozart some 50 years later. It's easy to judge Vivaldi's character when viewed through his business activities. One tends to see the least attractive side. But it's through his music and its subsequent influence that we should evaluate his true worth. His development of the concerto style was to influence all forms of composition in the 18th century and was a very important stage in the evolution of the classical symphony. Bach certainly regarded him as a composer of some importance and, in fact, transcribed 10 of Vivaldi's concertos. He was certainly a gifted orchestrator. The Four Seasons alone are evidence of that, and with his preference for expression rather than detail in his music, the pungent effects of his forward-looking harmony, the abrupt changes from major to minor modes, just as Schubert was to do, perhaps Vivaldi was the harbinger of Romanticism. It's worth considering. But one thing's for sure. In his attempt to paint pictures through music, he succeeded brilliantly in capturing the spirit and image of the golden age in which he flourished. We shall not look upon his like again.